I want to give you just a brief kind of review of where we've been with Elijah. And then I want to jump into the final story that we're going to look at today. Probably the second most famous story about Elijah. It's the story of the chariot of fire and the whirlwind that took him out of this world. As we get to that, please remember, over the last 8 weeks, we've looked at a lot of different life events in Elijah's life. It started out that Elijah appears on the scene in a time of crisis for the people of Israel. They had a king named Ahab. He was a really bad guy. He was worse than any of the kings who came before him. He married a woman from a different culture who worshiped the god Baal, who was the god of rain and thunder and storms. And so Ahab started worshiping Baal along with his wife and started leading the whole people of Israel to do this, to worship Baal. And so God sent Elijah along and he said, listen, I have one thing to say to you, Ahab. The Lord God, who is the God, it won't rain. It's not gonna be any dew until I say so, to prove that God is God, basically. And so a drought and a famine followed that pronouncement that went on for 3.5 years. All kinds of amazing things happened with Elijah that we learned about, and miracles followed Elijah's life. And when he gets to about the 3.5 year mark, he comes to this. He comes to the king because God sent him, and he says, "You're going to see rain soon, but let's have a contest. Summon all the people of Israel and summon the prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel, and we're going to have a contest. We're going to set up a sacrifice, and whoever's sacrifice is devoured by fire from heaven, their God is real." So the king said, "That's fine," and the people said, "That's great, whatever." And they got together, and after the prophets of Baal, went crazy trying to get Baal to act on their behalf and send some fire to devour their sacrifice, Elijah, he douses his sacrifice in water, and he prays a very simple prayer, a personal prayer to God, that God would send fire and vindicate him. And that's exactly what happens. Fire comes down, devours his sacrifice, the altar that's made out of stones, all the water that he had poured, that precious water that he had poured on the sacrifice, it's devoured by this fire that comes from heaven. And that Sunday, when we looked at that story, we wrote on rocks. Just one thing that we feel desperation for God to answer prayer. And we've been praying about those things throughout the balance of this series. And those rocks are there just as a reminder that a lot of us are carrying very heavy things we want for God to work in and work on. Then after this event, God sends rain, floods of rain. And Elijah goes into hiding, and that's where you caught up with him last week. Elijah goes into hiding, and he goes into a depression, a funk. And one person said to me this morning, last week really spoke to me because God can handle my depression. I thought that was great. Well, this week, we look at the very last story of Elijah's life, and it involves Elisha. You met Elisha last week. Elisha is the apprentice of Elijah. He's someone who God had shown Elijah, hey, he's supposed to be your understudy. And then he went and he got rid of all of his security, his plow, his animals that helped him plow, and he started to follow Elijah everywhere. So that's where we catch up with the story. Let's see it. This story, by the way, happens on the very last day of Elijah's life. This is what happens. It says, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal. Now, Gilgal, you need to know. Gilgal it's a place where that was important in the history of Israel. When the children of Israel passed over the river Jordan, they set up a camp over others as they attacked these cities and claimed the land for themselves, Gilgal was like their home base. It was their camp. And so when people would go there, when Jews would go there, it would be to remind themselves kind of who they were as a people. Might be like, today if you went to Mount Rushmore or you went to Washington, D.C., and you look at the monuments there and it inspires you about America. Well, that's kind of like what Gilgal was for the Jews in the ancient world. So they start out in Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has told me to go to Bethel." Now, Bethel is the place where God had appeared to Jacob, and there was a ladder that came down from heaven, a stairway, and Jacob saw this, and the place is called Bethel. Bethel means house of God, okay? And so while Gilgal was a reminder of identity and who they were in the past, Bethel was a reminder for the Jews of God's presence. And so Elisha replies to Elijah, "As surely as the Lord lives, and you yourself live, I will never leave you." Okay, this is, by the way, something constant that Elisha says in this story. He's never gonna leave Elijah's side. He's faithful to him to the end. And so they head to Bethel. And now I want you to understand, from Gilgal to Bethel, it's about 12 miles. And so they go 12 miles. We don't know if they're on animals or they're walking. That's quite a distance either way. And it says, the group of prophets from Bethel came to Elisha and asked him, "Did you know that the Lord is going to take your master today?" "Of course I know," Elisha answered, "but be quiet about it." And so there was this sense that Elisha had and that Elijah had, it will be clear, that this is the end. This is the last day for Elijah on earth. And he says to them, "Be quiet about this because he's going to miss this guy. This person this is his mentor." It says, then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has told me to go to Jericho." Well, Jericho's another 12 miles. Jericho's a hot place. And you might remember Jericho, centuries before, Jericho is the city where the walls fell down because the children of Israel marched around Jericho. It was their first defeat under their leader Joshua. And so as they are visiting these places in one day, Elijah and Elisha, they're kind of going on a best hits tour of the Old Testament, okay? And they're remembering, if they remembered at Gilgal their roots, and they remembered at Bethel the presence of God, surely when they visited Jericho, they remembered God's victory. So they keep going on. He says, Elisha replied again, "As surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, I don't know why you're going to walk so long, but I will never leave you." So they went on together to Jericho. And then the group of prophets from Jericho came to Elisha and asked them, "Did you know that the Lord is going to take your master away from you today?" "Of course I know," Elisha answered, "but be quiet about it." He doesn't really want to face it or talk about it. And then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has told me to go to the Jordan River." Now, the Jordan River is another 21 miles from where they are, okay? So they've gone 12 miles from Gilgal to Bethel. They got another 12 miles from Bethel to Jericho. They're going to go 21 miles, a total of 45 miles in one day. In the ancient world, that's a lot of sweating. That's a lot of hot. And they are making it there. But here's the thing about the Jordan River. The Jordan River, while the other places are important, the Jordan River, it's a reminder of God's power. Because the Jordan River is a place where God has shown up and done some mighty things. And in fact, you kind of get the sense that Elisha must imagine, hey, we've been on this weird journey all day long, going from here to there without any point, it seems. He must imagine something important is going to happen at the Jordan River. And it does. And of course, the Jordan River, it's important because this is a place where God miraculously splits water. This is a place where Jesus is baptized, we know later. This is a place where the people of the children of Israel from Egypt entered into the promised land, an important spot. So they're headed down there, and Elisha says to him, even though Elijah says, you can just stay behind, you can rest, you're a young fellow, you probably can't take it. He says, no. He says, look, as surely as the Lord lives, you yourself live, I will never leave you. So they went on together. You get the sense, right? Elisha, he's committed. Elisha is faithful. Faithful almost, when you look at it, you think, this guy's almost like fanatically faithful. And it says 50 men from the group of prophets also went and watched from a distance as Elijah and Elisha stopped beside the Jordan River. So I want you to understand, while Elijah and Elisha have been traveling together, whenever they came to a place, the groups of prophets in these different places, they knew that they were there, and they've been asking questions. They're aware that this is it. This is the end day for Elijah. And they've come along, and they're going out to the Jordan River with Elijah, and they just have the sense something important is going to go on here. That this is a place of significance for us as a people. And it says Elijah folded his cloak. This word folded, it's like he folded it and then he rolled it up like a little mat or something, just rolled it into like a tube. That's the idea here. He folded his cloak together and he struck the water with it. The river divided and the two of them went across on dry ground. Now this is a big deal. It's a big deal simply for the nature of what it is, right? Because, wow, the river split in half and the ground is not even a little bit muddy. It's dry on the riverbed and they walk right through it. But it's not just important for that. It's not just important because it's a miracle, but it harkens back in the mind to what's already been told about God and his power and how he was with Moses and how he was with Joshua in that he split bodies of water for them, right? He splits the waters open. The people of God in those cases walk through on dry ground. In one case, they're saved from their enemies. In the other case, they go in to possess the promised land that they've been waiting on for so long. And here Elijah comes and he smacks the water and it's split in half and they walk through on dry ground. I want you to understand that when we read this is where Elijah, for all the other things that he's done, remember, he's called the drought for 3.5 years into place. And he's done amazing things so far. He's raised a child from the dead. He's been fed by ravens, meat and bread twice a day in order to survive what's going on. He's called down fire from heaven, right? These are all impressive things. But this thing here, this thing of splitting the water with his cloak, this puts him on the plane with the greatest prophets of Israel. This puts him in the same class as Moses. Elijah, he's not just another prophet who's come along, but he's one of God's pinnacle people in history. And that's how the Jews see him, in fact. In fact, if you go to a Jewish home and you celebrate the Passover with them, the dinner, they save an empty seat for Elijah. Elijah's not involved in the story of the Passover, but he's that important. And when Jesus came along, he was doing all the things he was doing, right? The people said, this must be Elijah. That's how important he was. That's the significance of this event. It really means something to the people who are watching it, and it means something to Elisha. They walked across on dry ground. When I see this, I can't help but think about Elisha. Because Elisha really, God's trying to teach him something on this important day. He's trying to teach him a lot of things. Elijah doesn't need to learn anything. He's going to go to heaven real soon. But Elisha needs to learn something here. And every time that he's been invited to stop walking with his master On this arduous day of 45 miles journey from place to place, it's kind of a circuitous route, doesn't seem to be going anywhere in particular. He stays faithful. And I think we see this principle in this story. This principle that faithfulness over time and place leads to demonstrations of God's power. Faithfulness over time and place leads to demonstrations of God's power. What am I saying to you? I'm saying to you that plenty of people try to follow God passionately. They try to burn as bright as they can for about 6 months, and they give up because they think it doesn't work. And I'm saying to you, God's not interested in someone who just burns real bright for 6 months. God's interested in a candle that will burn steadily over a long period of time. And when you burn steadily over a long period of time, that's when miracles come into your life. It's faithfulness. It's faithfulness. Too many of us, we're fickle. Our hearts turn away. We make commitments to God that we break the next day. Faithfulness, obedience results in demonstrations of God's power. We've seen it with Elijah, right? He's been faithful. He's not a perfect person. Last week he was asking God to kill him. Last week he was in such despair that he thought he was completely alone, and God told him, hey, I've got thousands of people set aside who are faithful to me. Don't worry about it. Elijah's not perfect, but every time that God's asked him to do something, he's obeyed it. Let me just suggest to you, you want to grow in receiving demonstrations of God's power in your life? Grow in faithfulness and obedience. Every month when we focus on missions and a missionary here, we do receive a second offering. We can handle that in a whole lot of different ways. Why do we do it? Why do we do it that way? It's because I'm wanting you to hear from God and then obey him. When you do that, God's miraculous power is released in your life. The story goes on. It says when they came to the other side, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken away. What a rich, pregnant kind of question. Right? Tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken away. This is the guy who raises the dead. This is the guy who calls fire down from heaven. This is the guy who can stop it from raining for 3.5 years. Tell me just one thing I can do for you. Can you imagine if Elisha looked at Elijah and he said, my hip kind of hurts, and I just want to pray for good health and that I'd have a good job and everything when you're gone. He doesn't do that. He asks him for something huge. It says, and Elisha replied, please let me inherit a double share of your spirit and become your successor. Wow. He may sound a little conceited here, Elisha, because Elijah's the one with all this incredible power. Elisha's the one who's going to be like Moses, right? He's going to be enshrined as the greatest of the prophets who ever came out of Israel. And he says, give me double your power. Let me take over your legacy when you're gone. Now, when I read that, I just think that's amazing that he asked that, because he has the presence of mind to ask for something big. I want you to understand, he's not asking, by the way, for something mathematical here. We think of that from our Western perspective, that he's saying, I want twice of your power. It's not exactly what he's saying. In the ancient Middle Eastern world, when your father died, if you were the eldest son, you would inherit 2/3 of the estate. And when your father is laying there dying, if you're the eldest son, what you're supposed to come to your father and ask him in the ancient Middle Eastern world. You're supposed to say to him, Father, or when your father says to you, what can I do for you? You're supposed to say to him, Father, I want all that you have and more. That's what Elisha's doing here. He's saying, in essence, I want to be your spiritual son. I want to have the incredible ministry that you had and more. And I tell you, this is the challenge for me. Because I think we learn something about prayer here. We learn something important about the way it is that when we come before God and God basically says, hey, I love you. What can I do for you? This is the principle that's related to prayer. When it comes to prayer, go big or go home. When it comes to prayer, go big or go home. If all you're praying about every week is that God would bless the meatloaf, you're short-circuiting God's power and purpose in your life. Ask God for great things in your life. Ask God for audacious kinds of things that seem like that's impossible, that's beyond my most outlandish dreams, but I'll ask you, God, because I know you can do it. You know, I just want to point out, many of us, we don't pray like that because we are unwilling to respond to God's requests of us. But Elisha, he can make the big ask because long ago he settled his priorities. Too many people are only half-heartedly following Christ. And so there is a powerless kind of faith that we have because we're holding on to what we want. Elisha, remember, he burned the plow. He killed his animals and gave his meat to his neighbors. He had already given up on his former way of life. He had already made God the priority in his life. And that's why when the big question is asked, he makes the big request. And I just say to you, if you are regularly asking God for small things, if you are regularly afraid to ask God for big things, it just might point to the fact that your priorities aren't settled. You can chew on that. 2 Kings, verse 10, the story goes on. You've asked a difficult thing, Elijah replied. He said such funny things. Why is this any harder than calling fire from heaven or raising a little boy from the dead or multiplying the lady's flour and oil for 1,000 days in a row? Why is that so hard? And he says there's one condition, just one condition for you to receive this request. If you see me when I'm taken away from you, then you will get your request. But if not, then you won't. You can either be faithful and follow me to the end and get your request or not. And you know what? For us, it really is that simple as well. And so the story goes on, and he says, as they were walking and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire appeared. This is where, I just wish that he would have had, I wish we could open the Bible and there's a screen right there and we can see, the head-mounted camera that Elisha's got on, because he's, standing there walking along and all of a sudden this chariot comes and it's on fire and it's drawn by horses of fire. It's like, whew. He's like, whoa, what? And then it says this. It says it drove between the two men, separating them. And Elijah was carried away by a whirlwind into heaven. One of two people in the Bible, by the way, who it doesn't appear die. He's just swept away. And Elisha saw it, and he has the clarity of mind to point out, hey, I've met the conditions here. Hey, I did what you said I had to do to receive double your spirit and to be the successor of your ministry. He says, my father, I see the chariots and the charioteers of Israel. And as they disappeared from sight, Elisha tore his clothes in distress. I know that part of the reason why he's tearing his clothes is because he's grieving. He loved Elijah. It was the closest person in his life was Elijah, and he's tearing his clothes to show that he's grieving, but I think he's doing something else. I think he's tearing his clothes because he's done with his old way of life. He had been wearing the clothes of an assistant. Now he's going to put on the clothes of the prophet, of Elijah. It says that Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen when he was taken up, and that Elisha returned to the bank of the Jordan River. I have this 10-year-old, he's going to be 11 in November, and he does all the things that both I did when I was that age and that I wish I still could do. What's happening here is that Elisha, he's going to do something that a 10-year-old boy would love to do. I think most grown men have the spirit of a 10-year-old boy in them. Any women agree? You don't have to raise your hand. But it says he picks it up, and it says he struck the water with Elijah's cloak and cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Hey, I was here when he disappeared from sight. It's mine now. The power, it's coming to me. Where are you, God? And the river divided, and Elisha went across. Now, this was important. Because remember, those 50 prophets, they're watching. And when they see this happen, they know that Elisha is the true successor of Elijah. They know that he really is now in charge, so to speak. And so they're gonna follow him. They're gonna fall in line behind him. You know, when I read this story, one of the things that I think about is the fact that God, although he'd done amazing things with Elijah, Elisha's stories are even more amazing. You should take some time this summer, read through 2 Kings and read about Elisha and how his life turned from this point. But when I see this story, one thing I recognize is that God's work is always bigger than one person. God's work is always bigger than one church. God's work is always bigger than one moment. And I want to encourage you today, don't make the mistake of thinking that God's work begins and ends with you or with somebody else. God's work was going to go on past Elijah, of course. I might say it like this. This is the principle I'm trying to give voice to. God's work is bigger than one leader, style, or period of time. This church, just this last fall, we celebrated 90 years as a church. We've had some incredible leaders here. The pastor of this church from 1962 to 1991 was Charles Hackett. He was an incredible leader. People still to this day, he's been gone from here 27 years. People in town will still ask me where he is. What's he doing? And they've asked me how my dad is too. They think he's my dad, but it's not my dad. Very strange, awkward. But the point is, such great things happened with him. Sometimes some of us who experienced those amazing things can think, well, that must be it. That must be as good as it'll ever get. It'll never be any better. But what we learn from Elisha's story is that's really not the way that it works. God is always ready to keep moving on into the future. God always can accomplish his purposes with different people, with different structures. Something else that I learned, I observe in this story, because this is the end of the story of Elijah. I think about Elisha. On this day when he got all this power and he splits the Jordan River and all this, remember, he traveled 45 miles up to that point. He had gone from one place to another. Some of these places he visited with Elijah were abandoned at that point in history. He's going from one point to another. Maybe they're talking on the way about the things that happen in those places. But Elisha really, he doesn't know where this is going or why they're taking the route that they are. But he sticks close to Elijah anyway. And you know, the Bible is full of people taking journeys on routes that don't seem to be in a straight line. The Bible's full of people, in fact, who are traveling almost constantly. Abraham, the father of the Jews, the story opens up with him and God says to him, pack up from here. I'm taking you to a new land that's going to be your inheritance and for your descendants. The story of Jacob, the story of Joseph, the story of Moses, much of the story of King David. It's stories about being on the move and not seemingly knowing why your life is moving in the direction that it is. You know, it seems to me that for a lot of us, that's our experience of life. If Elisha had only been focused on the destination, I don't think he would have been ready for what was going to happen to him at the Jordan River. But instead, as he prevailed in the journey, as he stayed faithful to what he knew God had called him to, even though he didn't understand the way that the journey was happening, God was making him ready for the destination. And you know, for many of us, we go through life and we experience difficult things, or like stuff doesn't go like how we thought it should go. Maybe the people that we counted on or thought we could always trust in, they left us. Or maybe like you had great hopes and dreams for a business that didn't quite turn out. Or like you were making great plans for such and such, but your health turned. Or you got married with such great ideals and then found that it disintegrated. The key for Elisha is the key for us. Sticking close to God, even when we don't understand why the journey is taking the turns that it has. You know, I have a friend of mine in another state. He made some terrible choices earlier in the year. And in the process of those terrible choices being exposed, he found himself in trouble with the law. He found himself losing just about everything that he counted dear in his life. Not a single relationship in his life has not been impacted by these awful choices that he made. And he's been calling me now for several months because he kind of wants me to be like a pastor to him through these things. And as I was listening to him about what he's going through, and I was listening to him cry and just talk with anguish about the stuff that he's lost, and he's been repentant in the midst of this. I thought about Elisha. I thought about the fact that Elisha was faithful. And I thought about Ahab. Remember Ahab, the king that all this started with? That famine and drought that came in, it didn't seem to teach Ahab the lessons it should have. And I remember saying to my friend this last week, you know what you could do right now that might be really fruitful for you is to say, God, what is it you're trying to teach me in this season? In this hardest season of my life, what is it, God, that you're wanting to say to me? And I really think that's the key for many of us. If your life is going places you just never expected, or you keep hoping that it's going to turn out differently than it is, maybe you need to ask the Lord, Lord, what are you trying to say to me? And so the question for you today is this: what's God trying to teach you in your journey?